And basically, we're concerned with materials from the which objects are made, because that's what we have to deal with and their condition. This talk starts you underwater, and I put my first presentation slide here. In the picture, this is the back of a cannon. It's called the cascabel. In this picture also, believe it or not, is a bell. It's a ship's bell. And that's just lying in between these boulders on this particular site, which is in Sri Lanka. It's the Hercules from 1661. And the process, of course, we take photographs underwater, and then we recover the bell, as you can see in number 2. Then we take photographs afterwards, so we got a precondition before we start treatment. And here we have some of our trainee conservators in Sri Lanka actually removing what we call accretion, which is often covered in marine growth as well. This is the bell after its treatment. I wasn't there to see the treatment, so I can't actually show you what they used. Most likely it was dithionite or a chemical reduction process, or possibly even citric acid that we sometimes use as well, with an inhibitor called thiourea. And eventually, of course, the bell ends up on display. So that's the process, shipwreck to display. And just for your information, in the foreground here, we have an aquarium. Now, objects that come from the sea or from any wet site have to be kept wet. If they're allowed to dry, they will start to crumble or fall apart or disintegrate or corrode. So you can temporarily put them in an aquarium for a display. So in the second slide here, we have the reason why we need to do conservation. These materials are made on the land, of course. They end up in the sea, so the environment is changed. Metals corrode, soluble salts promote corrosion. You get biodegradation, so you get shipworm eating timbers, you get various bacteria deteriorating materials. And also, so we need to control those factors. So obviously the thing is in a certain condition when we find it. Once we bring it out of the water, we need to keep it wet, so it goes directly either into seawater or fresh water, whichever is appropriate. If we allow that to dry, the salt in those objects will actually crystallize, and that can cause damage as well. So not only hygroscopic and attracts moisture from the atmosphere, which promotes corrosion of metals, it also can destroy it physically. So that's what you can see here. This is the base of a dish, and the salt has got into the body of the ceramic. And as it's dried or been allowed to dry, and it shouldn't have been, of course, the salt has crystallized and occupied space. And the only way it can do that is by popping the glaze off. And that's why you see these little blisters here with the cracked glaze on the object. This is a pulley block. And this one, unfortunately, was allowed to partially dry. And you can see what's happened. That was fully intact. The surfaces were all complete. And now it's all cracked and it will shrink. And eventually will fall apart if you don't do the treatment that's required. And even after treatment, if you don't look after your things in solution, they corrode, or you get bacteria or fungi developing. So you have to make sure your solutions are replaced if necessary, or you have to put inhibitors and controlling factors into them. Okay. So how do we identify the materials? Now, obviously, there's a lot of things like these objects here that you can identify as what they are. So you've got ceramic, there's different forms of ceramic. So you've got terracotta, this is a roof tile, you've got stoneware, and you've got porcelain over here. Porcelain is very highly vitrified, so it doesn't necessarily absorb salt. So there is a possibility you could recover it and dry it and it wouldn't have an issue, but it's always safer to desalinate. And desalination takes place initially, usually for ceramics, we recommend you use seawater with half fresh water, so you're not giving it osmotic shock. If you've got a strong solution in the object and you've got a weak solution, if the salt's trying to come out too quickly, it can possibly damage the surface. Can't say I've ever seen it being a problem, but that's what we're supposed to do. Similarly with glass, glass holds liquids. Why is it a problem? Well, underwater, if they sit there long enough, they start to break down, believe it or not. The constituents in the glass dissolve, the glass becomes weaker, and so on. And actually, when they get dry, they will start to fragment. The surface will start to peel away. So we've got copper alloy, and the obvious clue here is that green coloration. That's suggestive of an aerobic or oxygen present in the water situation. So it's not completely buried with no oxygen. And that means it's corroding and you get these green oxides of the metal. That's a bronze bell, so that's tin and copper. This is copper sheathing, which is more likely to be combined with zinc. Then you have some pipes here. There's the bowls of pipes, which is pipe clay. You've got lead. This is a sounding lead, and so on. And if nothing else, if you were to pick a lead object up and you weren't sure what it was, it would be heavy. If it wasn't made of gold, the chances are it's going to be lead. Okay, the other factor which is interesting and useful is the corrosion products on metals actually can indicate what they are made of. I already mentioned this. So you've got copper alloys in aerobic environment. They've got these green salts and oxides on the surface. So that's an indication of what that object is made of. And of course, that indication of what the material is indicates what kind of treatment you can apply, conservation treatment. So here we have a wooden block. It's still got the iron. It's actually got a hook on here. This is iron, which is covered in what we call concretion. And concretion forms it's a product of corrosion. It's a product of calcium carbonate in seawater that deposits on the surface. You get sand, shells, corals, you name it, whatever. It will actually bind up and form like a cement jacket over the object. And we have to remove that. And in this case, it's quite exceptional preservation because often the metal doesn't survive. And this wrought iron here is actually in very good condition. If the concretion, there's no metal surviving, the concretion forms a mold. And from that mold, we can actually cast a replica. This is a silver fob watch that was found on HMS Pandora from 1791. And that is made of silver. And one of the indications for silver is that you can get an effect from the light. Silver salts react to light, and this is the old photographic process. And actually, sometimes that can be an indicator of that material. It wasn't terribly significant because basically all these things were simply kept wet. But usually in the field in seawater, if that's what you've got, you've obviously got fresh water, but it's usually for people to drink. Okay, and this bone, by the way, this is actually a human thigh bone or a femur. And this bone was sitting upright in the seabed in a vertical sort of position. And it actually became an indicator from the transition for an oxygenated zone in the seabed material. And here you have the anaerobic zone. So this bone has got iron contamination. There's cannons, there's cannonballs, there's anchors, there's all sorts of things on the seabed that can contaminate other materials and other objects. And this has therefore stained the object, and iron corrosion products in anaerobic conditions go black. So that's the transition zone. Quickly switching across now. Here we go. One of the things I need to know, sorry about that, I'm moving on too quickly there. One of the things we need to know is, as a conservator, I want to know what kind of ship it is and what it's made of, because if it's a wooden ship, it's primarily wood. If it's an iron ship, it's primarily iron, or it can be a composite of both. And that means a wooden ship with iron fastenings and iron knees that actually hold it together. So that's interesting because the amount of material and the type of the material can have an impact on what survives in a shipwreck. Also, does the archaeologist wish to recover maybe machinery from the ship? Now, we have the Xantho engine in the shipwreck galleries. That's recovered from the Xantho from 1872. And of course, that's a major operation. You don't say, oh, we found an engine, we're going to recover it. You have to come back and make sure you know what you're doing and how you're going to do it. Okay, so there's the steam engine. I won't linger on the slides. There's probably too many for the talk in the short time we have, but you can see that at the shipwreck galleries if you want to come down sometime. Also, what kind of ship it is. Essentially, and when I say ship, we also look at aeroplanes underwater. It's usually wrecked from the Second World War. what are the materials associated with a particular kind of ship. You can imagine a passenger ship like the Titanic. There's all the passenger materials. There's suitcases, shoes, all the things they took onto the ship and lost when it sank, besides their lives, of course, which happens as well, of course. And then you've got, sorry, again, I've done it. There's the warship. So here we have HMS Victory. You can imagine that means a lot of cannons, cannonballs in this particular case. There'd be big anchors, lots of other things, gunpowder, you name it, barrels, obviously food for the crew. Of course, personal possessions like on the Titanic, that's the thing about diving on a shipwreck. It's when you find those personal things, you realize that people were involved in this. It's not simply a shipwreck that's just gone to the bottom and no one lost their lives. So that's the connection we have.
Just maybe remind everyone to mute.
I've got it to work on mine, so I'm just going to have to plug it in.
What?
Okay. Things like a merchant vessel, well, obviously will either be empty because it's already delivered its cargo, or probably have a cargo. And you may not know what that cargo is until you actually start investigating
So
the
what's
wreck.
working from here on?
But that can form a large collection on a ship. You know, you see the amphorae on the ships in the Mediterranean. Now, if you have an exploration vessel like Cook's Endeavour, obviously you'd probably be finding interesting instruments, telescopes, survey equipment, and so on and so on.
Sorry, John, do you mind just saying to Nat, can she please mute?
Nat, can you please mute? Is that right?
Yeah, I tell her, I've admitted. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, it's okay.
Excuse Nat, we can hear you at Wamsy, but can you just mute yourself?
Yeah, so we'll come up here, it's fine. And remember, we may have audio so that we'll hear what you're saying, possibly.
Wait, so a video calling?
Excuse me?
Right now?
Excuse Nat, do you mind just muting? We can hear you. We can hear.
Why do you put us on mute?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and as I mentioned, also there's aeroplanes. Here's a Japanese seaplane in Truk Lagoon or Chuk, and we do investigative work on those. We do corrosion measurements. We do corrosion measurements on all sorts of underwater materials. Okay, we did that one. Back again. Sorry again. Here we go. Next one. Now, you might think how long something is underwater is the main factor of whether or not it's going to survive. But the truth is, it's the environment in which it is. So if it's exposed to the water column, yes, you're going to lose timbers because shipworm will eat them and so on. Things like ceramics survive exposed unless they're abraded by sand movement and erosion and so on. But essentially, it's the environment. So when a ship gets buried, the environment is usually conducive to preservation. And that's why in the Mediterranean, you have shipwrecks which are over 2,000 years old with amphorae on the top, but underneath there's still timber. And that survived because once there's no oxygen, shipworm can't penetrate or won't survive without oxygen. So essentially, it's a preservation. The only thing is the deterioration. And that means the timber is waterlogged and very friable and will disintegrate and shrink and crack and so on if you just simply recover it. So it's not straightforward. That's why conservation is necessary and why we have to keep things wet. Now, obviously, we have an expedition. Initially, if a shipwreck is found, reported by somebody discovering it, even by accident, we've had a number of situations off the West Australian coast where that's happened. Then a team of archaeologists will go out, maritime archaeologists, and they will look at the vessel and they will take measurements and all that kind of thing, try to determine what vessel it may be. So if they find a bell, they might be lucky enough to have the ship's name on the bell. It's not always happened. It doesn't always happen. But anything that's of value, like a ship's bell, silver coins, which have got many thousands from wrecks on our coast, they will take them away because they are subject to possible looting. As soon as people know where a shipwreck is, it's amazing the number of people will obviously like to see it, but also want to go for the purpose of removing material and keeping it from themselves. Also, sometimes there may be a land site associated with a shipwreck. This one is from the Zoutdorp, and that is a survivors camp. So if a shipwreck is near the coast and people get ashore, they obviously try to survive, and there is evidence of that. And that could be empty bottles, maybe a few coins, bits of pipes, and so on and so on. And that's what we found on the cliff top near where the Zoutdorp from 1712 was wrecked. Also, if you've got, eventually it comes down to a full-scale excavation. So underwater here we have the wreck site of the Pandora with all the grids set up to do measurements, because it's very important to document exactly where things are and the relationship between them, because that will paint the picture. Obviously, when a ship goes down, things get mixed up. A ship will usually settle on the bottom if it goes down on from its stern down, on the keel down, and then it usually rolls to one side. And that's why you end up with one set of timber surviving and the other half of the ship is sort of eaten away and disappears. And that's the case with the Batavia timbers that you can see in Fremantle as well at the shipwreck galleries. Also, we do take sediment cores to ascertain where the anaerobic zone is and see what's happening in the seabed. And as I mentioned, we also do corrosion measurements. Of course, a bit of research is useful if you know where you're going or what you're doing, or you can find a similar report on a similar kind of shipwreck in a journal or various other places. Then you can essentially be forewarned and forearmed before you go. So you've got an idea of roughly what you might expect. So in this case here, this is a picture of the harbour in Galle Harbour in Sri Lanka with all the sailing ships and the lightering vessels. And this was taken in the late 19th century. And this one here is a present day, a wreck of a vessel alongside one of the wharfs. And essentially it looks like one of these ships here. So there's a clue straight away. I know it's not confirmed, but certainly looks like one of those, one of the lightering vessels. So I'll give you some clues as to what you're working with and what you're looking at and what you may find if you're lucky. And the other thing, of course, is where is the ship wrecked? The Pandora is in about 30 meters of water. It struck the Great Barrier Reef in Queensland. It ploughed across the top and then it went down in 30 meters of water alongside the reef, more or less. When you get there, you can't see the reef. All you see is open ocean. It's a little bit disconcerting stopping in the middle of seemingly nowhere and then going down and eventually seeing a shipwreck. But that, as I say, is how it appeared after we started work. This one is in Sri Lanka. This is where the Hercules was wrecked. It was smashed on these boulders and it's fairly shallow. It goes down to about 9 meters, but it's a lot of boulders. And consequently, the cannon, this is a cannon that's been badly eroded. You can see the boulders have been abraded by the sand movement. So consequently, a lot of the smaller objects possibly have dropped through between the gaps. But the cannon, large, robust objects like cannon, maybe anchors, survive a little bit better just because of their size, providing the concretion, which forms the corrosion products that form on the outside, like a cement jacket, is not compromised. In this case, it has been, and it's been sculpted out by the sand movement. So that cast iron cannon is gradually being eroded away and corroding at the same time. The other thing that's obviously very important is having a place where all this material goes. You shouldn't indiscriminately recover material if you don't know how to look after it. And essentially, if you're working on a shipwreck, you need a conservation lab. And that's what we did. We set one up in Sri Lanka, happened to be on a jetty, which is probably not ideal. It's too close to the ocean. But we have our shipwreck museum in Fremantle as well. Not special photos, but the main thing you really need is tanks and storage containers. Because if you keep things wet, they can last for a long time before you actually start conservation treatment. So we need to obtain things that we're going to recover things. So here we have a lot of plastic containers. We put a little fishing weight on the corner to stop them floating away, because some of these things have an inherent buoyancy. Obviously fill them with water. We take it down to the seabed. This is not always the case. This is on the Pandora. This is 30 meters down. So you can't keep popping to the surface. Can you hand me that container, please? You need to go and get it from something on the seabed, and that's what we did here. So we have jars, Clear jars are useful, probably not glass, more plastic, because you can see what's inside. Because when you're in the water and you're diving, and the communication can be difficult, you know, you come to the surface and you're probably pretty exhausted and you're trying to tell someone, look after this, it's got something special inside, it's very delicate. Then obviously if they can see what it is, they've got an appreciation straight away. And also the fact that that jar is absolutely full of water, there's no airspace, so therefore the object can't move around or slop about and get destroyed. Plastic bags, all sorts of things, net bags, and so on. And there's that little lead weight I told you. Simply a little hole drilled in the corner and a fishing line attached. And of course, we as conservators, I'm a diver and we have other divers. A lot of conservators don't dive, but if you can become a diving conservator, then you can dive underwater. And sometimes the archaeologist may wish you as a conservator, with your experience of materials and their deterioration, in other words, their condition, if it's poor, they might say, oh, could you do this, John, because you know what to do and how to handle this. And that's what we do. So we go in, but it's not to take away from the archaeologists. We're not trying to do their job. If you want to recover it and you're confident, then it's not a problem. So this is, you don't need to read all of this. And by the way, you'll have these PowerPoints to look at leisure and get the information. But this is just a list of some of the things we try to record when we're in the field. We don't always get everything. We get obviously where it is and all that detail and the day and the date and so on. But we want to know how much of the shipwreck is exposed. We want to do corrosion measurements and so on. And this happens to be in Galle Harbour in Sri Lanka. This is the Avonster from 1659, and that's a plan of the shipwreck. And doesn't end there, it keeps going. There's a lot of things. They're taking a core and so on. Also, we need to set up a conservation lab in the field. This happens to be on a ship, so we could create quite a useful area. Sometimes it's just on a beach and you've got your tent and you've got your place where you do your work. We don't often do work in the field, but if we're in the field for 6 weeks, then you might want to start some conservation work, as long as you're the person who's qualified to do it, and you make sure you document everything you do, because someone else may take that over, and there needs to be a record of everything that's done. Also, the archaeologists may wish to draw or photograph things, and in that case, we give them water sprays. That can be seawater. And we simply keep the objects wet while they're exposed outside of their storage water tanks. So, registration, very important. You need to give a site code. This is Batavia, BAT, and then a number. That gives you the location of that find, where it comes from. Things get mixed up on shipwreck sites, so obviously if we can work out where they've come from on the ship, we can possibly work it back to where someone's cabin or a hold or something like that. So registration is very important. We use Dymo labels. They're more durable. The modern ones and the ticker machines are not very good. They don't last. We can use Tyvek, which is a sort of a woven material, artificial material, and we can use a permanent marker to write on it, which is a simple way of labeling something in the field. But documentation and record keeping is very important. Okay, underwater, we've got archaeologists taking photographs and so on. We also do that. We do corrosion measurements. So here, this is myself drilling into a cannon, and we can take a corrosion measurement. We use a pH probe initially. So we drill a hole through the concretion to the metal. We put in a pH probe very quickly, of course, because I've got all that seawater out there. It's going to affect the level of pH. And we take a pH reading, and it's usually quite acidic. Seawater is about 8.2, which is alkaline, and then underneath the concretion is acid. The rate of corrosion has slowed, but it is an acid environment in there. And then we put in a platinum probe, which gives us a small measurement on a multimeter, a microcurrent. Those two readings can be related, and that will tell you what's happening to that object, whether it's actively corroding or whether it's immune. If there's other metals nearby, so if you've got copper and say you've got iron, usually the iron will corrode in preference and actually protect the copper. Similar with silver coins, like on my shipwrecks, those coins largely have been protected by the presence of lots of cannons and cannonballs and so on. So here we are, multi-cameras. This is old film cameras and video cameras. These days, everything's changed. This is old school. Anybody can take an underwater photograph with a digital camera now. Doesn't mean you're good at it, but you can. Also, how you actually excavate underwater. Probably running out of time. But yeah.
I'm not sure how much time we've got.
Yeah,
Then
sure.
I'm going to ask some questions.
Good, fine, of course. Yeah, so conservation starts underwater. These things are already deteriorated, so you want to make sure you handle them in a manner that it's not going to make it worse and they're going to disintegrate or so on. And so you've got a man here, he's hand fanning. So we don't actually put our water dredges or our airlifts that remove the sand like an underwater vacuum cleaner. We actually hand fan the sand into the mouth of the object, of the dredge. And that way you expose something without sucking it up and setting it up the pipe and smashing it to pieces. Now, there are also things on the seabed which can be dangerous. So we got mercury. We found mercury in this little jar. It's not going to be dangerous in the water, but mercury gives off a vapor when it's exposed and is dangerous to your health. You shouldn't be playing with it in the lab as we used to. And then you've got substances you don't know what it is. So bottles and things don't have labels necessarily. There's a substance in this bottle. I don't know what it is. Turned out to be some white, would have been a powder initially. But I'm being careful. I've got some gloves on and I'm transferring, because this bottle was broken, transferring this white powdery material into a separate jar and putting on it unknown substance warning sort of thing. Also, sometimes we find objects which are full of sediment. And if we lifted this rather large jar full of sediment, then the potential is it could collapse when it got to the surface. So what we did, we emptied it out into the trough on the seabed, and then we searched that later to find if there's anything inside. Didn't look like there was anything in there in the first place, but we took the precaution. Similarly here with these smaller jars, someone's emptying them out on the seabed, and that shouldn't have been done. Someone got a nice picture of it though, because they may have something inside, and you don't need to empty those like that. They're going to fall apart. Right. And then, of course, we went to recover a cannon from the Pandora. There's the cannon, concreted, lying on the seabed. And we have to excavate around, in this case with an airlift. And you expose what's there and then see if it's free, whether it needs to be detached from the seabed. In the process of doing that, we found a watch. So it's a pear case watch, belonged to the ship surgeon. We found that out. And also what's called an etui, which is a little instrument case. And also in the case of backfilling the site, so ideally you need to recover the site to protect it. We found other things outside the zone in which we considered the ship was located. So this is what happens. You do find things where you don't expect. Also, it's not uncommon to find things inside something, even unrelated objects. So this leg, probably from a fireplace on board, is made of brass, it's hollow. And in the process, so we emptied it out into a tray, the sandy sediments and water, and we found tiny little beads inside there. And can only assume that these were trade beads. So this ship was in the Pacific Islands, and perhaps the sailors thought, oh, if we take some beads and stuff, we can probably trade for some of the local crafts or whatever they make, you know. So don't empty your bottles out over the side of the ship without checking first. Sorry about that. Also, we found a fireplace on the Pandora. That's from the captain's cabin. That's a replica, by the way, that was made based on this one that was found underwater. Also, interestingly, we found some seashells in the sandy sediments after we recovered it. We found quite a lot of seashells. Now, this is Barrier Reef. Of course, you can find nice seashells. But the interesting thing was, one of the shells we found was a Triton trumpet shell, which had actually been used as a trumpet. So it had a hole in the spire, didn't have the rope and everything. This is the one that Cook collected years before. And therefore, that was an object of man-made, essentially, or worked by the Polynesian people. And the other thing is, interestingly, because of the research that was done, the captain on the ship was asked to make a collection of seashells. Now, if we found a bunch of shells together in different ones, we would think, oh, maybe this is it. But that's the point. it's all very well when you're on the seabed, you think, oh, I'm working on a shipwreck, I find a seashell, I'm going to take that home, I like that. But in this case, it actually probably could have belonged to the ship. So we collected any seashells. We do some work in the field, not much. Just depends on how long you're in the field. So drawing, photographing, so on and so on. Again, you see the water spray, and that's some objects we treated in the field. In fact, those two objects, we deconcreted them or removed the accretion, and that's after treatment in the field. We had a geologist on board who actually assessed the stone. He told us that it was safe to use certain materials on the objects to clean them, so we did. Also, as I say, we cover up shipwrecks afterwards, and this is two methods that we've used. This one is in Port Phillip Bay in Victoria. On the Clarence, we actually covered the wreck in shade cloth, and then we covered it with PVC tarps. And the reason that was done, the shade cloth starts the process of creating an anaerobic environment. The PVC sheeting over the top also does that. So we're actually improving this preservation. But also there was a number of fishermen going to this site and dragging their anchors through it. And we considered if we only put shade cloth down, that's obviously going to get hooked up and torn off. But the PVC is smooth and therefore less chance of that happening. We use sandbags to hold it all in place. It's a bit of a job unfurling all this stuff underwater, but it's possible. And this is what happens after your shade cloth is on the seabed. If there's sand movement and sediment movement, it actually drops through the mesh. And when it drops through the mesh, it builds. And that's why you've got this real compacted, very hard covering, a sandy layer entrapped in shade cloth. And we've also trialed this method in Coburn Sound around the wreck of the James Matthews. We use road barriers. This is at the railway station in Fremantle, where we covered these holes up. They were sealed up, and it was put around the wreck, and the idea was to fill it with sand. We didn't realize just how much sand we needed, but we started the filling process. And that was a trial that we did to see how it would work. How we go for time? Just about there? I'm just about finished.
That's good.
Okay, so of course, at the end of the expedition, or not at the very end, but near to, we have to start making sure we pack everything to deal with the journey back to the conservation lab. And of course, if you've got a ship rocking around like this, you want to make sure everything is padded and also kept wet. So anything that's had to be wrapped, you use things like cloth materials, hessian, all these kind of things, wrap them up, seal them up, and make sure it's all saturated inside so it doesn't dry. So simple things like ice cream containers and so on are sealed with tape. This is, you'll find this in Bunnings of all places. It's an agricultural gel that's usually put in the soil on pot plants to maintain the moisture with the plant, obviously. And I sort of had this idea, why can't we use it for shipwreck artifacts? And I've used it a number of times and it works. The beauty of it is it holds the moisture which you need, and it's also resilient, so it takes up any shock in travel. That was broken on the seabed, by the way. It wasn't done just to show. This is a cannon that's been all wrapped up. It's wrapped in, obviously we've got sandbags. You can use old tires to sit it on the deck. And it's hessian inside, and then it's wrapped in plastic and sealed. And in this case, actually welded bolts to the deck to hold it down, because in a rough sea condition, that could travel around the deck and do some damage. Yeah, okay. We're just about done. Photography and research, obviously necessary. I'm going to flash through this because I think we're at the end anyway. Come on, go ahead. Yeah. These are just a few of the objects that have been treated. So that Itui, that instrument case, that's before, that's during, that's after. A watch from the Pandora before, and so on and so on. Let's go back again. That's after reduction treatment. There's the hands on the face of the watch. That's the gilded or the gold plated, as it were, fire gilded mechanism inside. And that's the watch after treatment. Same with this pistol from the Pandora, French pistol, treatment, wood, copper alloy, lead, flint, you name it, all those materials are in there. And that's afterwards. It looks a pretty awful mess, but it was put back together and that was the finished pistol. So that worked out quite well. And there's a final shot just to show you that once an object's finished treatment, this is one of Cook's cannon, it has to be maintained in an environment suitable for that material. Unfortunately, in museums, we have lots of different materials all in one place. We're also trying to make conditions suitable for human beings or people who visit the museum. So sometimes it's a compromise. So even though this has got a lot of things about temperature, light levels, and so on, and obviously it's better to have it inside than out because it's not a cannon that's been outside forever. It's been underwater, it's deteriorated, degraded, and therefore you need to control the environment. And that applies to everything. Put it in a display case, you can buffer the environment somewhat. But again, there's usually mixed materials in there anyway. Okay, that's pretty much it. Sorry I had to zoom through, but we didn't have much time. Any questions?
Thanks. I might just stop sharing. Maybe we can see your face. So they can... Are you ready to ask some questions, Avi and Matt?
Oh,
Yes.
yes.
Do you want to ask some questions, Avi? Did your students or Nat, do your students have any questions? I think you might be muted, Avi.
Oh,
You're back.
says mute when. Okay. Thank you very much, John. It's amazing to see these things brought back from where they went. My colleague Scott has a question to get the ball rolling. Would you like to? He'd like to jump in. Thank you. Thanks again.
Yeah, John, I just have a question. So I read recently that Titanic apparently is going to be completely deteriorated by 2030 due to biofouling. And then you compare that to the Batavia, for example, that was 400 years old and remarkably intact due to, and it's wrecked in very volatile conditions. So I'm just, what are the factors that lead to that deterioration? And theoretically, how long could a shipwreck like the Batavia survive if it was left in a concretion, for example?
I think it boils down to the environment and also the materials involved. The Titanic essentially was an iron ship, or essentially an iron ship, wrought iron, cast iron, with all those other fittings, all the other materials on board, the copper alloys, glass, you name it. Of course, a lot of different materials. Batavia also had different materials, but environmentally was in a different situation. The Titanic, I think, is about 3 kilometers or something, or 4 kilometers down. It's in a cold environment. It's subject to that biodeterioration, the bacteria that's forming the rusticles, and it's just inevitable over time and many years. It's still going to be there for a long time, but eventually it will collapse. And it will sit on the seabed and continue to collapse. And eventually, I don't think it's going to be in our lifetimes in the sense of we're going to be seeing nothing there because there's always something. But the Batavia, if it hadn't been excavated or recovered, I suspect it still would have been there as it is pretty much now, in the sense that the timbers that we have would probably still be the same. So, it's 1960s, 70s that Batavia was recovered. There was building stones from the portico that was on board. There was cannons, of course, and all that material sat on the timbers that became buried. And that's why those timbers survived. There are timbers that we have that don't fit on the reconstruction because they come from parts of the ship that actually we just can't fit them because they don't belong to that part of the ship. So there are, extraneous timbers, if you like.
And Matt's got a question. Sorry to butt in. Has technology assisted with recovery of materials from shipwrecks? And did you work on the recovery of HMAS Sydney? So the first one is technology helping with the recovery.
Yes, obviously, technology is always improving. The HMAS Sydney, they've not recovered anything from that ship. It's a war grave, and I believe that's the rule. There will be nothing recovered from the ship. And what has been done is, with the wonderful technology of underwater ROVs and the camera work, high definition camera work, they've taken fantastic imagery of the shipwreck. And same with the Cormoran. That's been done. I'm sure if you go online, you can find that information, but the intention is at this point not to recover anything from those ships. We did several years ago now, a young guy was snorkeling at Red Bluff towards the north, and he came across a pistol, a German pistol, in a coral in a hole in the reef, and it turns out it was lost or thrown away by one of the German survivors from the Cormorant. So we do have that pistol. It's on display in the Geraldton Museum. It's not complete. It's obviously corroded, but it still had bullets in it. And so that the survivors from the Cormorant came ashore and they were captured. And before they were captured, apparently they threw their weapons away to show that they were disarmed and there was no threat to the people who were arresting them, basically.
Thanks, Nat, for that question. Anything more from Christchurch?
Anybody got any questions?
Last one of the questions on the board.
How much items retrieved, like the size of the
Got one question here. How are larger items retrieved or recovered? For example, the stern quarter of the Batavia, is that? Yeah, that larger, more challenging objects. Thanks.
Yes, that's, I mean, there are individual pieces, but yes, it was recovered, that stern quarter. It's actually a very small part of the ship. If you come into the Shipwreck Museum, you can see there's a model where it's indicated just how much of the ship or how little of the ship we actually have. We're lucky to have a gun port, at least the door to the gun port. And there's a feature, the waterline markings, the depth markings in Roman numerals that survived, and we have that. And there's even some repairs on the timber that we can see, and that was obviously done. Yeah, so I'd say in terms of structure recovered from the ocean, the Batavia timbers and the portico would be the largest things that we recovered in Western Australia. We've got lots of cannons. We've got bronze cannon, cast iron cannon, but obviously they're quite relatively small in that regard.
Other questions?
Oh, Nat said most challenging site to recover from.
Ollie, most challenging? I would say the thing about shipwrecks, of course, they end up in nasty places if they don't just sink in the ocean. And usually it means they've struck something. So if they struck a reef, now reefs are subject to turbulence, subject to big seas, all those kind of factors, currents, and so on and so on. And that can make it difficult to work. So that can be applied to virtually any shipwreck on a reef. In terms of the risk factors, I would say probably the Zoutdorp or the from 1712, which is at the base of Calvary Cliffs. And that's in very shallow water, really. It's only literally the only Dutch ship that we have, or VOC ship, that's actually struck the mainland. Everything else has struck reefs offshore. And that even applies to the Gilt Dragon, which hit a reef north of Lancelin. And that actually hit a reef as well, even though it's only 5 k's off the beach. Yes, so yes, there's outdoor. The problem there is open ocean. There is no protection. There's no reef. The seas can be huge at times, and it's only when you have calm conditions. And ironically, that's usually in cyclone season when you have the big calms. And if you get caught in a cyclone, that's a problem, of course. But yes, I have dived there, but we've done it in a safe manner. We've come from Calvary in a boat. We've anchored off the cliff face. And in the relatively calm conditions, because there's always some seas coming through, you can dive. Previously, we had divers coming off the land, jumping into the water. There's never any problem jumping in. It's getting out that's a problem. So I said, no, I'm not going to do that, but I'll help you to stay safe. So essentially, I used to tell them when they could go down underwater and tell them when they had to go when the big seas come in. I'm still here and so are they. but they used to cut themselves coming ashore. And the thing is, you wait till the time is it when it becomes dicey? Is it a problem? Shouldn't you get out before that happens? And it's making that decision. It's all a bit of a challenge. Batavia also has its difficulties. The workboat got caught out there one day, actually smashed the windscreen on the vessel. No one was hurt, fortunately, but yes, it can be very, very problematic if you're not careful. Also, they had one small dinghy sink at one point. They had a what they call a hooker unit or a compressor pumping air down to the divers. And unfortunately, one day it got swamped and it came down alongside them. But fortunately, with those units, there is a couple of cylinders inside with compressed air, which is still available to you underwater, and they were able to surface. And that's something you should be able to do as a diver. You learn that it is possible. You've got compressed air in your lungs. You can virtually take a breath on the seabed and slowly let that air out as you ascend. And that way you can survive. But obviously too deep, it could be a big problem.